Chapter 18 of East by West by Henry W. Lucy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. Chapter 18. Roadside and River. We left Nikko at 8 o'clock in the morning, our cavalcade as usual the centre of a dumbly staring throng comprising 1/3 of the population of the village. As we dashed down the uneven street, with a stream of fresh water running in the middle, another third of the population, chiefly women, were kneeling on either side, washing pots, pans, kettles, dishes, everything but the children. These last were running about, hideous in their dirt, yet withal plump and well made. In those reforms which the wise and far-seeing statesmen who now rule Japan are pressing forward, it should not be difficult to introduce one on behalf of the children who swarm in the streets of country hamlets. When Mr. Ito, not our guide but the Minister of State, recently made his journey to Nikko, his quick eye noticed the condition of the roads, and his practical hand promptly plucked at the root of the evil. He must have seen something worse in the pitiable state of the children, which varies only in degree of dirt and consequent disease, whatever road be taken through the interior. The Japanese government, with all its newly grafted Western ideas, is essentially paternal. It should not be difficult to make and enforce a few simple sanitary rules on behalf of the children. Their mothers and fathers could not take it unkindly, since they are scrupulously clean about their own persons, and would rather go without their evening meal than their evening bath. At the end of the long street which is Nikko stretches a shady avenue of cryptomeria, with the sunlight gleaming at the far end. In hot summer weather this must be a grateful place for the dusty traveller, like the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. In November the mornings are like those in late spring in England, and almost as leafy, though the trees have taken on autumn tints. In addition, the chrysanthemum is blooming in every garden, and often by the wayside. The rice harvest is in full swing, and close by the brown wet earth whence the crop has been cut there are long furrows in which bright green shoots of some other crop boldly stand up. So fruitful is the soil of Japan when skilfully treated, and so kind the weather, that in many places two crops are garnered in every year. I read a good deal about Japan before starting to visit the country, and it is with ever-increasing astonishment I recall the fact that from no book did I get the impression that Japan is a country beautiful to look upon. Yet it is surprisingly fair in all the varieties of hill and dale, fruitful plain, and water everywhere. We stopped at Osawa for tiffin, Ito providing for us in the accustomed civilized bountiful style, whilst the men who had run 20 miles since morning contentedly ate their eggs and rice, deftly fishing the latter out of bowls with their chopsticks. Across the beam of the tea-house were pasted sheaves of little bits of paper, being the introductions of travellers who have stayed there. These letters of introduction form a connecting link between series of tea-houses throughout the country. One landlord passes his guests on to a friend at the next stage, as he has guests recommended to him from the preceding halting place. The abundance of these scraps of paper testifies to the popularity of the tea-house. At Osawa we were introduced to a fowl of great and peculiar beauty, though not unknown to poultry shows in England. He was of perfect shape, of bantam size, and his manifold feathers were turned the wrong way. As he strutted about, conscious of the important part he was playing in maintaining the prestige of Japan, The tip of his tail feathers tickled his comb with a persistency maddening to a bird inspired with less lofty purpose. Ito was much interested in this phenomenon, and wondered how it was brought about. At Nikko there is a temple where a portion of the elaborate carved work on a pillar is turned the wrong side up, with intent to defeat the malign purpose of evil spirits. It is believed that if the temple were finally completed, the demons, envious of its perfection, would destroy it. Therefore a few inches of the carving is turned the wrong way to show that the building is not finished. Remembering this, I suggested that the bird's feathers were turned the wrong way to show that it was not finished. "I don't think it's that," Ito said, though there was no tone of strong conviction in the assertion. Poultry is the one livestock in which Japan may glory. The horses are miserable, the cattle, what there is of them, are stunted and ill-fed. The dogs are the veriest curs, not worth the trouble of tying round their necks the little wooden labels on which are written the names and addresses of their owners. But poultry are abundant. They take kindly to their food, and though not particularly good when brought to table, yield large returns in the way of eggs. More rice fields on both sides of the road all the way to Omaya. Men, women, and children busy in the fields, and the old men and women at home spreading out the rice on the drying mats. We passed a little mite, certainly not more than 4 years old, trotting along the road bravely carrying a big teapot in front, balanced by a baby strapped on her back. Placed in the scales, baby and teapot would have made the little woman in the other scale kick the beam, but having them once fixed on and being set going, she trotted along, dressed in clothes exactly like her mother's, cut short to her size. We reached Omaya just before dusk, completing 46 miles in the day, and having done one spurt of 14 miles in an hour and 3/4. Ito does not think much of this. We have each 2 coolies, whilst he has done 55 miles in a day with a single man. Moreover, there are 3 men in Tokyo who can do 70 miles in a day, and one, a prince among his fellows, who does this distance within 12 hours. Whilst dinner was being made ready, I wandered about the roomy kitchen of the tea house, and held a good deal of conversation with its inmates, scarcely any the less interesting because neither understood the other. The Japanese are such a good-tempered, merry race that it is a pleasure to talk with them, even when nothing comes of it. The ground floor of the tea house opened to the street, silent save the voice of the blind shampooer calling for custom, formed a striking picture. Outside, after the manner of the old English inn, there swung a signboard covered with cabalistic signs, whose meaning was plain enough to the wayworn native traveller. There was no door, porch, or entrance hall. The front of the house had simply been taken down or pushed back, disclosing a long, low interior, its recesses and unexpected nooks dimly lighted with oil lamps, and here and there a Chinese lantern. From the thick and blackened beams of the ceiling hung sheaves of letters of recommendation, mementos of vanished travellers. The room on the left, by day a passage and by night a bedroom, had all to itself an oblong lantern 8 feet long, furnished with farthing candle power, but diffusing a wonderful soft light. It was well it was not too brilliant, for a little further on, in a recess leading out from the main passage, was the bathroom, with 4 men naked and not ashamed. On the right, a few steps along the raised matted floor, which no boot or shoe has ever pressed, was a broad flight of 8 steps, leading to the only upper story. Little waiting maidens, always chattering and laughing, were running up and down serving the dinner of the native guests. The kitchen ran the full length of the house behind the staircase. It was full of twinkling lights, amid which moved dusky figures bent on domestic duty. On the right, behind a charcoal stove with many openings for pots and pans, stood the Japanese cook in the flush of evening work. A little lower down, kneeling over a modest hibaichi, was Ito cooking our dinner. The glow of the fire reflected on his face brought out the supernatural gravity with which he tested the savouriness of the mulligatawny. In a dark shadow in a part of the kitchen nearest the street squatted an old gentleman with head closely shaven save for a lovelock over his left ear. He was making tea by a fire sunk in the floor, only making believe to brew tea, I suspect, his principal interest being to retain a snug place by the fire. As he spread his skinny hands over the glowing charcoal and felt the fire, the expression of his face resolved itself into a fixed, mild smile that began on his thin lips, illuminated his bare brown face, and shone with subdued lustre over his shiny, shaven head. Our bedroom, which served also the purpose of dining room, was neat and clean. Over one wall was a large scroll with writing on it. I thought this was what is known in Japanese house furnishing as a poem, but Ito explained that it was an injunction to temperance. If you drink, Ito literally translated it, you will miss your hairs. A poetical fancy which seems to require some thinking over as a preliminary to comprehension. We started from Omaya to catch the steamer at Koga, our men trotting merrily along as if they had been resting through the earlier days of the week. It was again a bright English May morning, so clear that among the clouds in the horizon to the left we could distinguish the white cap of Fuji. We had a desperate rush to catch the steamer, and would have failed but for a strategic movement on the part of Ito. Taking on a fresh coolie, he went in advance, and reached the pier just as the little steamer had got into the middle of the stream and was heading for Tokyo. In obedience to Ito's signals, the steamer obligingly put back and awaited our arrival. It also waited till Ito had concluded a purchase of crockery, for we were to lunch on board, and plates are not included in the odd property of a river steamer. It was a curious little craft, with paddle wheels and a hurricane deck on which passengers stepped from shore, and whence in reaching the cabin they made a perilous descent on to the bulwarks. Captain, officers, engineer, and crew, about 7 all told, were in a condition of wild excitement on discovering the nationality of their passengers. As far as they were concerned, Ito might have lingered to buy up all the plates in Koga, so long as they were permitted to revel among our belongings. Our coats, our dress, our pipes, and our boots were in turn the object of their curious regard. But the great object of interest was a pair of air cushions, which, by the way, persons about to make a journey in jinrikisha should never be without. These puzzled them beyond measure, till the captain, observing the brass nozzle, ventured to blow into it. To see it gradually inflate filled them with unalloyed delight. The first mate, who had apparently been having his watch below, and, called up by a sudden alarm, had forgotten to put on his trousers, seized upon the second cushion and blew into it till I was obliged to take it from him. Another blast and it would have burst. All this time the crowd on the beach had been gathering, including a large contingent of two-headed children. There was some fear that we should never get away, but Ito having come aboard, and a deputation of two jinrikisha men having come down to bow their acknowledgments of a little present made in recognition of their manful work, the engineer, who had not been able to get hold of one of the air cushions, spitefully blew his whistle, ropes were cast off, and we moved out into the eddying yellow stream of the Tonegawa. We passed onward through a level and sparsely populated country. The banks were flanked with willow trees, and now and then from under their overhanging shadow we disturbed a flock of wild ducks. We steamed past several junks floating with the current, and by many men fishing out of punts. Our young gentleman from Glasgow was at this stage of the journey the most interesting feature in the landscape. Seated on the deck, his boots, at any time an appreciable object on a square acre of ground, came into full and prominent view. They were shooting boots, made to his order, with exaggerated soles spreading beyond the uppers, and the tops lacing well above his ankles. The bare-footed Japanese crew regarded these monstrosities first with awe, then with an overmastering curiosity that brought them at whatever risk to group themselves on the deck around the boots. I suppose someone was steering the steamer, and I could see the anxious engineer with his body thrust upward through the circular hole that gave ingress to the engine room, but I declare there was no lookout, every other man of the crew, from the captain downward, being seated round the young gentleman from Glasgow, examining his pipe, feeling the texture of his Scotch tweed, running their fingers over his ribbed stockings, or glancing sideways at his boots. He, on his part, freely entered into conversation with them, having great faith in the English language when slightly improved by use in Glasgow. Moreover, he had a small glossary of Japanese words. With this in his hand, he managed to conduct a conversation of much length, though of doubtful meaning. When in a fix, and having slowly repeated syllable by syllable what he had to say in the English tongue, he finally put his mouth to the ear of his interlocutor and bawled the words over again, as if deafness naturally accounted for the difficulty of comprehension. At length, the united efforts of the captain and crew succeeded in making clear that they wanted him to take his boots off. One naturally supposed that the steamer being so small they wanted to trim her, but as they left the boots together on the same side of the vessel, they were probably afraid of the ravages of the nails upon their deck. When the excitement had subsided and the crew returned to their posts, I saw the captain heave alongside, take up one of the boots, gaze reflectively upon its broad spike-studded sole, put it gently down, and go away. After a few more turns he would stop, take up the boot again, turn it over in his hand, and replace it. In the afternoon, coming on deck after luncheon, we caught the first mate, still without his trousers, in the act of trying on the boots. Right away in the stern of the little steamer, only approachable with infinite peril of tumbling overboard, was a minute cabin registered for the conveyance of 16 passengers. If the 16 had been herrings, they might have been packed in, but it was difficult to see how any other kind of passengers could be so dealt with. Nevertheless, if we wanted deliverance from casual passengers, we three must pay 16 fares, which in the end we did, the total amounting to a little less than £3. Forward of our cabin, separated from it only by sliding panels with glass windows, was another cabin. There was no one in it when we went on board, but presently it began to fill, and long before we reached Tokyo we had ceased to regret the little extravagance in the matter of a private cabin. An hour out we began to pick up passengers. Thereafter they came and went on crowded wharfs through miles and miles of country, gradually increasing in signs of life and labour. The steamer did not always stop to be moored at the wharf. Out from some little ferry would shoot a punt with a solitary passenger on board. The steamer slowed, but did not take the trouble to cast out a rope. When the punt got alongside, the passenger, taking off his clogs, threw them on board, then jumped on himself. The steamer puffed ahead, and the punt soon faded in the distance. All the native passengers, before touching the spotless deck of the steamer, took off their clogs. One of the crew, or possibly it was the purser, handed each a wooden check. A corresponding one was tied on the clog, and as the passengers departed, the clogs were claimed. At a place called Saki, the river divides, and the little steamer went through a difficult and dangerous passage to reach the branch that leads to Tokyo. What had frequently been threatened occurred, and she ran aground. After a desperate struggle she was pushed off and safely reached the pier at Saki, where a great crowd of passengers awaited her arrival. Saki is a busy place with a considerable number of junks and sampans, a double row being fastened to the wall. The river junk is a Japanese home, and we saw varied domestic arrangements going forward in these lying quietly moored. Looking at one junk slowly making its way into the broad stream, we saw two naked bronzed figures under the overhanging stern. It seems to be the maritime habit of Saki that when a junk puts out, two of the crew jump overboard and push her from the stern through the shallow water, which not infrequently merges in a mudbank. Passengers came on board, squatted on the floor of the cabin next to ours, sitting as near the hibachi as possible, though the sun was streaming hotly down out of a cloudless sky. Most of them were smoking, men and women. They seemed to pass the time pleasantly enough, bowing recognitions or farewells, chatting, smoking, and laughing. At 5 o'clock we turned into the canal and made our way through a densely populated quarter of this suburb of Tokyo. The canal, which lay almost due west, was the pathway of the setting sun, and was ablaze with splendour in the borrowed rays. The town itself was not without interest seen from this new approach, but the captain, through Ito, earnestly besought us not to remain on deck. It seems the little boys of Tokyo have discovered that it is very hard to catch them after they have thrown stones at the steamer as it makes its way through the canal. Accordingly, with the pleasant humour peculiar to little street boys in all parts of the world, they stone the steamer, not without result, as some broken windows in the cabin testify. But we did not remain below long. It was worth risking something to pass through this busy hive of life, with the Chinese lanterns beginning to glint amid the growing dusk, and all the glory of the setting sun crowning the head of Fuji. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of East by West by Henry W. Lucy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. A Japanese Theatre. We reached Tokyo in time for dinner, after having in 6 days travelled 250 miles by a circuitous route. It may be useful to know that the journey cost us, a party of 3, a trifle over £36, or £2 each per day. On arriving at the hotel, we remarked that Ito was coming along with our baggage. The mention of our guide's name had a remarkable effect upon the landlord. His face lighted up with joyous recognition. "Ito!" he explained. "Ito, great friend of mine. His house burned down last night. Everything lost. His mother burned out." It is a long time since I have seen a man in such a state of exultation. That he should by good luck be the very first to tell Ito this great news, after a sojourn of 6 days out of the reach of letters or newspapers. Ito might have gone straight home to Yokohama, and then someone else would have told him. Whilst I was wondering how I could keep this really amiable man from Ito, or at least induce him to break the news gently, the guide himself appeared. The landlord made a dash at him, and seizing him by the hand as if to congratulate him on some momentously happy event, he cried, "Ito, your house burned down last night. I got telegram." Ito was evidently stunned at the blow thus ruthlessly dealt. It was only yesterday he had been telling me how he had bought the house just 2 months ago, and set his mother and sister up in it. Now it was gone, and Japanese houses are never insured, for the sufficient reason that no insurance company will grant policies. "Well," he said after a pause, during which the landlord had been eagerly scanning his face, "it can't be helped." This was disappointing, but the landlord had other shots in his locker. "Everything burned up!" he cried. "Well," said Ito with a brave little smile, "it can't be helped." Things were looking hopeless. Now was the time to bring up all reserves. "And your mother burned out!" he roared, greedily devouring Ito's expression with his eyes. "Anybody hurt?" "No," said the landlord, a little chapfallen. "Well, it can't be helped," said Ito, forlornly going back to his formula. After this the landlord retired utterly routed. Never had he had such a welcome home for a traveller, and Ito had taken it all as calmly as if it was a match that had been burned. The fire was a very serious one to others besides Ito. It began about 11 o'clock at night at the top of the Japanese street in Yokohama already described. The fire god was promptly brought out and placed between the boundary of the fire and the houses yet untouched, but the flames laughed him to scorn, would even have burned him too, had he not from time to time been moved higher up to establish a fresh boundary. Water was scarcely of any more avail. Japanese houses are made of wood and paper, the materials in ordinary use in Western lands for kindling a fire. Once aflame, the fire goes as far as the wind will carry it, and by 1 o'clock in the morning 460 houses were burned to the ground and their inmates homeless. I saw a letter written by a native clerk engaged in one of the European houses. It is a gem of epistolary correspondence. It ran thus: November 7, 1883. My dear Talbot, dear Sir, will you please give me a only 1 day holiday, because I am very sorry my house set in fire at this early morning, therefore I most look after my family and co. Your upstair boy. We had arranged to go to the theatre in the evening, but in view of Ito's affliction, I suggested that the visit should be postponed. Ito, however, with the philosophy that had actuated him on first hearing the news, declined to be let off. "I can't do no good now," he said. "It will be all the same if I go down to Yokohama by the last train." So it was settled, to my permanent satisfaction, for it happened that on this particular night we saw the Japanese drama at its best, located in a handsome building, presented by a crack company, and the piece chancing to be one of the most characteristic and widely popular. The theatre at Tokyo is a new one of immense size, and was, on the night of our visit, densely crowded, notwithstanding the fact that the prices are, by comparison with English theatres, surprisingly high. But then, as Ito observed, you can stay all day if you like. Theatre going in Japan is a serious social undertaking. The doors open early in the morning, and the performance is not over till 10 o'clock at night. Thus, when the Japanese go to the theatre, they literally make a day of it. There is, in connection with the theatre at Tokyo, a tea-house where refreshments are obtainable at reasonable prices. This is within the building, and people who have once obtained entrance are permitted freely to pass from the theatre to the tea-room. But there must arise occasions when, in the course of the day, there comes to persons a desire to leave the theatre. The head of the family may want to go home to look through his correspondence, or to transact an hour's business, by way of foil to the exciting pleasure of the drama. In such case, a device is brought into use worthy the attention of English theatre managers. Instead of receiving a pass-out cheque, the patron of the drama holds out his right hand, and on the wrist the attendant stamps a mark which has the advantage of not being transferable. Hence there is at the door of the Japanese theatre no crowd of boys or men begging for your cheque. All one who has been out has to do on returning is to show his wrist, and he is passed in. Theatre going being essentially a family arrangement, places are disposed of accordingly. There are, of course, no chairs, everyone squatting on the floor. But in the Tokyo theatre the auditorium is broken up into something like sheep pens, in which family circles or companies of friends squat. Everywhere there is the hibachi and the everlasting pipe. Men and women fill the minute pipe, thrust it in the live ashes of hibachi, take their 3 whiffs, and then knock out the dust, presently beginning the process over again. On the night of our visit there was a special attraction in the nearest approach to a ballet permitted by Japanese customs. A body of 43 dancing girls had been engaged, and since dancing on the public stage is an innovation in Japan, there was a great rush to see it. The girls themselves were handsomely paid, and by way of compromise with a consciousness of infringing immemorial custom, they handed over their wages to a local charity. This is all very well to begin with, but there is no doubt the thin end of the wedge has been inserted, and within 12 months this exceedingly modest approach to the ballet will be further pursued. The dance itself was to the Western taste a melancholy and soul-depressing performance. 43 damsels, dressed precisely as if they had walked off a Japanese tea tray, moved in a single file across the stage, and down the gangway running at right angles with the stage, and passing through the mass of the audience in the pit. This is a peculiarity of the Japanese theatre which is really very effective. Instead of the actors and actresses entering from right or left of the stage, or from behind the scenes, they walk onto the stage, as it were, out of the pit. The green room, instead of being at the back of the stage, is at the front of the house, and there are 2 gangways, one for approach and the other for exit. Another striking peculiarity, and I venture to think an improvement in the Japanese stage carpentry, is that the scenes revolve upon an axis, something on the principle of the merry-go-round at the fair. There is no dragging of scenes hither and thither by heated supers, and no necessity for weights. A scene is set by a revolution of the machinery which brings not only the scene, but the actors in full view of the audience. When the scene is played out, there is another turn at the crank. Scene 80 is ground out of sight, and scene 81 comes on. In cases where an untimely death takes place on the stage, and, the scene not being closed, it is not desirable altogether to change it, two figures draped in black, with black hoods over their heads, enter and remove the corpse. According to common understanding, these hooded figures are supposed to be invisible. In Western countries, the movements of stage machinery are directed from the privacy of the side wings. In Japan, on the left-hand side of the stage facing the audience, there kneels a man with a piece of wood in either hand, shaped after the fashion of a clog. When a scene is to be changed, he raps on the floor with the clogs, and the machinery moves. His duties are further extended in the direction of imitating footsteps. Thus, an actor entering by one of the gangways already described, his approach is heralded by an excellent imitation of running footsteps played by the man with the clogs. Only there is this peculiarity about it, that, reversing the ordinary state of affairs, he begins the pattering of feet in the distance with tremendous rapping, which cleverly dies away to the slightest tapping as the footsteps approach nearer to the stage, and might therefore be presumed to be more audible. On the other hand, a kettle drum, which forms a prominent feature in the orchestra, occasionally, and apparently à propos des bottes, begins to be beaten with slow tapping, increases at tremendous speed until it reaches a deafening roar, at which it stops as suddenly and as inconsequentially as it began. The orchestra is composed partly of instrumentalists and partly of vocalists. Both sit in a cage on either side of the stage, the front being fenced by a gauzy trellis work through which the figures are dimly discerned. Whilst the drum suddenly goes off in a kind of epileptic fit, and a most unmusical thrumming is upraised by manipulation of an instrument called the samisen, the vocal orchestra on the other side from time to time break forth in most monotonous and most melancholy chant. The stranger notes that whilst this chanting is going forward, the actors on the stage interrupt their play and stand or sit motionless and silent. Ito explains that these are the joruri singers, and their duty is to describe to the audience what the silent actor or actress is at the moment thinking of, to depict the passion that tears his breast or the regrets that sadden it. Thus, if Mr. Irving were playing Shylock at the Lyceum at Tokyo, instead of being troubled during the trial scene to express his feelings by movement of the facial muscles, he would stand quite quiet, whilst the singers in the cage would describe to the audience that his breast was torn with rage, because, having expected to cut a pound of flesh from the plump person of Antonio, he now discovered that, owing to the erudition of Portia, the suspicious bearing of the judges, and the weight of general circumstances, he could enjoy his revenge only at peril of his own life. The 43 dancing girls entering by the gangway on the right of the stage advanced with measured and unvaried movements. First of all, with right hand uplifted above their heads, and left hand extended downwards and slightly outwards, they swayed their bodies to the right. Then, with position of arms reversed, they swayed to the left. Thirdly, they slowly turned round. Fourthly, they took 3 steps forward, then swayed to the right, next to the left, and so on da capo. It took about 40 minutes thus to advance by one long gangway across the stage and disappear by the other, always with the same motion, with the strumming of the samisen from the orchestra and the intermittent epilepsy of the drum. After 10 minutes, the performance began to pall on the jaded Western palate, but Ito sat with lips slightly parted, eyes fixed in admiration too deep for speech, and so sat all the audience through the full 40 minutes. "Beautiful!" Ito exclaimed when it was over. "Very nice!" The last damsel, always swaying to the right, then to the left, and slowly turning round, disappeared through the doorway amid thunder of applause, and the thread of the drama which had been interrupted was taken up. The play had been going forward through the greater part of the day, and when we arrived at the theatre somewhere after 8 o'clock, it was pretty well advanced. The scene opened in front of a pretty tea-house, and revealed a two-sworded man, apparently on the rampage. He was asking a girl for a drink, which she served him with ludicrous contortions indicative of abject fear, which convulsed the audience. It should be mentioned in further proof of that modesty on the stage which makes it a memorable thing even for singing girls to appear in a decorous dance, that in Japanese theatres all the female parts are taken by men. The two-sworded man had evidently been recently engaged in active strife. His unsheathed sword was stained with blood. Whilst he drank, he held the sword behind him by way of soothing the frighted damsel. In this position he was taken unawares by a sortie of guests from the tea-house, who, apparently resuming proceedings earlier commenced, rushed upon him with sticks, brooms, and other things picked up haphazard. But the two-sworded man, refreshed with the water, proved invincible. His terrible sword flashed in the air, and his vanquished assailants were standing, after a brief tussle, quietly with their backs to him, as if he were going to measure them for a coat. He drew the sword slowly but firmly across their naked flesh, and they rolled upon the stage, the gore freely flowing. 2 of the assailants fled, but whilst one man was being sliced, another stood by, and when his turn came, presented his back, was slashed in the same business-like fashion, and rolled upon the stage with more ebullitions of gore, greeted with loud applause from the gallery. I could not see by what trick these bounteous gouts of blood were made suddenly to appear, but it was very cleverly done. In scene 143, or was it 195, the two-sworded man had another encounter with a couple of casual passers-by. This was a good up-and-down fight, the combatants rolling on the ground 2 to 1. But the two-sworded man added 2 more victims to his lengthening roll, and drew forth another cheer by wiping his dripping sword on the edge of the stone bridge by which the fight had taken place. Whilst thus engaged, a woman appeared on the scene. She uttered a shriek at sight of the two-sworded man, and he emitted a fearful growl. By this time we were getting used to the spirit of the play, and were not at all surprised to see the two-sworded man approach the woman and slay her. After hacking her till she fell to the ground, he placed the sword in her mouth, and thrust it so far down her throat that in withdrawing it he was compelled to put his foot on her chest, and nearly fell backward as the sword came out, an effect which again brought down the gallery, though, if they only knew it, It is as old as the day when last Porsenna marched on Rome, and Horatius and his 2 comrades kept the bridge. On Astur's throat Horatius right firmly pressed his heel, and thrice and 4 times tugged amain, ere he wrenched out the steel. This done, the man with the clogs beat a rattling accompaniment, at which signal 2 hooded figures entered and carried off the now embarrassing agglomeration of corpses. The next scene is an exceedingly pretty one, though as nobody is murdered it falls a little flat. The villain is discovered standing in front of a Japanese house, drawing water from a well, such a well as may be seen in any street in Japan. He washes his ensanguined sword, and finally his feet. Whilst thus engaged, a servant-maid comes out and discovers him, again going through a pantomime of terror, which, though perhaps a little overdone for English taste, was really very funny. Ito explains that the 2-sworded man, having escaped from his enemies, a considerable proportion of whom must by this time be dead, has come on a visit to his uncle and aunt. The girl, when she finds her voice, informs him that his uncle is out. Presently the old gentleman is discovered entering by the gangway. It is a wet night and a dark one, so the uncle carries his umbrella, whilst before him goes a servant with another umbrella and a lantern to light his footsteps. This was a pretty scene and a realistic one, the man evidently approaching his own house instead of accidentally turning up from the side, as he would have had to do on an English stage. As the uncle and his servant cross the gangway, clogs patter loud for the distant footsteps, falling to a mere tapping as he comes nearer. The drum goes off in a fit, the samisen is thrummed, and whilst uncle and nephew stand and look at each other, the jurori singers explain their feelings. Then the stage revolves, and we discover the 2-sworded man squatted down in the middle of the room. To him enter uncle and aunt, who squat on either side of him at a brief distance. The nephew relates with judicious moderation his sanguinary story, amid slow music from the caged minstrels on right and left, who play and sometimes chant. The story is intolerably long, and is varied by few interruptions on the part of his listeners. Once the aunt interposes with a remark delightful in its naivete. "It was very fortunate you did not kill yourself, hurting so many other people," she says. The audience, who know all about it, having been there since 7:30 in the morning, cry "True!" and "Good!" It is curious that the sympathies of the audience are entirely with the 2-sworded man, a circumstance explained by fuller knowledge of the drama. Captain Brinkley, editor of the principal English paper in Japan, a profound student and an authoritative writer on the Japanese drama, subsequently related to me the full bearings of this popular play. It is the old story of man's love and woman's perfidy. The 2-sworded man had had entrusted to him by his master a precious family heirloom. Delilah had betrayed him, had joined a conspiracy to deprive him of his treasure, and had imperilled what to the honest man was even of more value, his character as a faithful servitor. These many people he had slain were concerned in the plot, and the woman from whose throat he had found such difficulty in withdrawing his avenging sword was Delilah. Now he had come to the house of his uncle to tell his melancholy story, and to perform the only act left to a dishonoured and disgraced Japanese, that of suicide. Having completed his narrative, the nephew announces his intention to commit harakiri, a duty to his family highly applauded both by uncle and aunt, though the aunt, to do her justice, shed some tears. Nothing could exceed the politeness of the bearing of each member of the party towards the other at this critical juncture. Before addressing each other, they bowed till their foreheads almost touched the ground, and their words were full of high-flown courtesy. I observed that the two-sworded man was much longer in cutting his own throat than he was in dispatching other persons. But an end must come to all things, and there is an end to his long harangue. The aunt spreads upon the floor a white cloth, without which no harakiri can be properly conducted. The nephew kneels upon it, the aunt and uncle grouping themselves on either side, the aunt still audibly in tears. The nephew, with a polite gesture, borrows his aunt's pocket handkerchief, which she, with much graciousness of manner, hands to him. He wraps it midway on the blade of his sword, and then thrusts the weapon into his stomach, working it about to the ecstatic delight of the gallery, which reaches a climax when the gore rushes forth in unlimited profusion. Suddenly there is a sound of drums outside. There is a cry. The police are coming. The two-sworded man thereupon cuts his throat, the stage revolves, and the hapless nephew, the didactic uncle, and the tearful aunt disappear, with the clogs rapping, the drum madly throbbing, the samisen strumming, and the party in the cage on the right explaining the feelings of the uncle and aunt, which indeed may be well imagined. End of chapter 19, and end of volume 1 of East by West, A Journey in the Recess, by Henry W. Lucy. Recording by Ruth Golding.